Hello and welcome to another presentation. This time we're going to be focusing on something a little bit different. So you know our usual formats, what's new in Medium, interviews powered by Medium, but we're kind of leaning into something different here. We kind of want to give you an idea of the way we think about formats, the way we think about publications, and how those things can affect what's possible with different formats and different publication types. So this is exactly what this presentation is about. It's called Format and Expectations. So in this presentation, we'll have a very specific scope. We're not going to be talking about every single publication format out there because there's too much. So I'm specifically going to focus on three different things: expectations around EPUB. I'm not going to be doing a presentation of EPUB, but I'll talk about expectations around EPUB. I'll also talk about the web. Same, I'm not going to be explaining what the web is, but we'll see how the expectations on the web are very different from the expectations in EPUB. And finally, web publications. I know this one is kind of different and new for most people. This is not a presentation that will introduce you to web publications. There is a link below that video that will do that. And we might do a presentation in the future that kind of explains what web publications are all about. So, yeah, if you're interested in that, we'll probably push something later this year. So just to clarify though, even though we won't be doing a full presentation about web publications, if you're wondering what they are. So web publications are a unified representation for all kinds of publications. Textual publication, so that can be EPUB, DAISY, audio publication, audiobooks, DAISY once again. DAISY is used for accessible content. Visual publication, so comics come to mind, highly illustrated books, for example, books for kids, with a few words and a lot of illustration next to them. And yeah, you can actually even encapsulate more than that in web publication. You can encapsulate videos or even PDF. Um, and yeah, so we designed this within Medium as a single JSON document that is capable of tying all resources together into a single publication. So a lot of people kind of expect that what you can do on in EPUB is different from what you can do on the web. So I often see people saying, "Oh, okay, this is HTML5, or this is something you can do on the web, but I cannot do it in EPUB." And oftentimes people think that this is because of the way the formats are built. And what the slides kind of show you is that this is actually wrong. It's not about um, the technical capacity of the format. Because when we look at those different formats, the three I'm going to focus on for this presentation, EPUB, web publications, they'll have the same building blocks. It's HTML, all of it, CSS, JavaScript, fonts, multimedia, video, images, audio, whatever you want. So the building blocks are very much the same. There's no difference, um, but the expectations are different. And I think it's actually those expectations that kind of shape what you can do or not do with these different formats. I've mentioned expectations, but I know it's not necessarily clear what I mean by expectation, especially expectations for publications. So before I go into details and illustrate what I mean for each format, I think it's useful to go through those expectations. So one of the common expectations we have for publication is offline access. If I have an EPUB or if I have a PDF, I have an expectation that I'll be able to read that content offline. So I can, go on holiday or I can take a train. I'll be able to access my EPUB entirely or my PDF entirely, which is not necessarily the case if you're on the web, for example. Another expectation that we have can be around protection. So it's not necessarily a user expectation, but it can be a publisher expectation, or it can also be an expectation that is tied to the business model of those publications. The best example of that are public libraries. I can go to my public library and I can borrow um, I can borrow an EPUB, or I can borrow comics, or I can borrow audiobooks, and eventually this will be returned. It's a protection in the sense that the content is protected and it will expire. So that's one example, but you have other means of protecting content. Another one is progression. So, what do I mean by progression? Progression is the concept that if I have a publication, I can start from the beginning of the publication and kind of go entirely through the publication from the very beginning, the cover, until the end. So it's this linear way of consuming a publication. And then together with progression, we have the concept of navigation. So navigation is different, whereas progression is I go from the start to the end. Navigation is I want to go somewhere. So navigation can be I want to go to a specific page or position. Navigation can be table of contents. Navigation can be following links. It's kind of how we go around the publication. So you need both. You kind of need both progression and navigation. Another very common expectation for publication are visual adjustments. So visual adjustment, especially in ebooks, there are very high expectations for them. So I kind of expect that for a number at least of publication types, I'll be able to read them on any device, and the presentation will adapt to my device. And I'll also be able to decide how I want to change the layout, to change the font, those kind of things. So this is also a very common expectation. Then there are a lot of expectations around accessibility. So I think, um, especially in the context of the European Accessibility Act, uh, we want to make sure that anyone can access a publication, regardless of whether I use a screen reader, whether I use a Braille tablet, whether I use text to speech, or just a super big font with, I don't know, something easier to read for me. A lot of expectation around accessibility. And those expectations are also quite different from the one that we have on the web. Um, and then we also have interactivity. So this one is a bit less obvious, but it's very important when we talk about specific type of content. Let's say textbooks or other learning materials, or I don't know, an activity book for a kid. Those would be a good example where interactivity can add value and kind of go beyond print. So they can also be expectation for digital publication that are related to interactivity. So now that we've talked about expectations, the question is what makes EPUB different? And I think there are a number of things to point out. The first one is, and that what made EPUB different in the beginning. EPUB is essentially a zip. You have everything in a zip, and that's super convenient because you can, send it around on an FTP, email, whatever you want. You can archive it. And initially, when you compare EPUB to what existed before, it's the one thing that made it different. And yeah, it also means that those different resources taken together become a publication. So it's a big part of what makes EPUB different compared to, for example, what exists on the web. Another thing is that now that you have all those resources together and you said, oh, those resources together are a publication, the ability to express metadata about that publication using well-known vocabularies such as Dublin Core, which is heavily used, for example, by libraries, and schema.org, which is widely used on the web. That's very useful too. On the web, you can say, oh, this page has those metadata, but there's not an easy way of doing that for a group of resources. So this concept of zip, and then you give metadata to a zip, makes EPUB kind of unique in terms of expectations. You have generic support for obfuscation and encryption. Obfuscation has been very useful in EPUB for being able to embed font, and encryption makes DRM possible. So we were talking about protection before. It is possible to apply DRM to EPUB. uh, much more complicated on the web. And yeah, there is a generic way of saying that something is encrypted, which is used by standard DRM schemes like LCP, but also by proprietary DRM schemes, the one used by Apple, Google, Kobo. They have their own DRM, but they still use what is available in the format to do that. Um, One thing that always comes up is that people think that EPUB has less support for HTML, but as I've already said before, that's not true. What makes it kind of different is that you're forced to use an XML serialization of HTML. So yeah, there are a lot of ongoing talk about changing that, but yeah, up until now, it has been the case. But yeah, in truth, I don't think any of those big technical things that I've mentioned are the biggest or the most impactful one. I think what is the most important part of it is that reading apps provide a very different UX from browsers. So, because they provide a different UX, because they provide different features, there are different expectation. And I think that is actually more impactful than technical details. And yeah, we're going to walk through some of those expectations and some of those features. So first of all, there are a lot of expectations that are related to the layout in EPUB. So here's a typical example of a screenshot. This is actually Thorium Web on a laptop, but it could be any number of EPUB reading system on any number of device. This could be laptop, this could be desktop, this could be tablet. And as you can see here, I have the typical paginated page layout. I have two pages or two columns, whatever you call it. And yeah, that's what you would get with a lot of EPUB reading systems. But it's far from the only thing you can get. Let's say that I don't like having two columns. I prefer having one. That's actually possible. Let's say that I want to have a longer line or a shorter line or whatever. That's also possible because you can really do whatever you want. You could even do more than one or two columns if you want. So that's still in Thorium Web. We even provide the ability for people to do much more, advanced layout. But you could have three columns, you can have four columns, you can have pretty much whatever you want, because that's the expectation with EPUB. It's not the content that decides; it is the reader, the user that decides how the content is presented in terms of layout. Um, so that can be the case with paginated layout, but that can also be the case with scroll layout. So this is another example. This time I'm reading one resource, one chapter at a time. I would scroll through the entire chapter. And then, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, I have affordances to go to the previous chapter or the next chapter. But yeah, there are also reading systems where you can just scroll through the entire book, the entire publication, and it's just like one gigantic scroll. And yeah, what you get depends from the app you're using, and it depends from it's also based on the setting you decide. So that is the concept. Reflowable EPUB is what you want it to be. It's not what the content wants to be. Um, and then another thing that's very important too are the expectation when it comes to progression. So when I read an EPUB, here I'm still on a laptop example. So you always have affordances to manage progression. So here you can see in red, I have arrows for going back and also for going forward. But it's not just buttons I can click or tap on. Usually, you expect that if you're on a touch screen, you can tap on the left or on the right. You expect that you can swipe in both direction. If you have a keyboard, you expect that you should be able to use the arrows or the spacebar. So there is this expectation with an EPUB that using a simple affordance, the same one, I can go through the entire publication. Um, the nature of the affordance changes based on the nature of the device, but most of the time you'll have multiple way of doing that. Um, that is also very different from what you would get, for example, on the web. And then you have everything related to navigation. Um, for example, usually EPUB files have good table of content. A table of content can be a nested structure. So as you can see here, for example, I have House of Saven Gables, and then I have the chapter below it. So that's a pretty simple structure. But if I'm reading a textbook or a guidebook or a cookbook, it could be a very complex structure. It could be multiple levels, deeply nested that I can open and I can close. So yeah, it is. There is an expectation of having a pretty powerful affordance for working with that table of contents. And then, of course, the display for the progression is not just for knowing how far I am, it's also for sharing that information. So if I'm in the book club and then there's a friend who's reading the same book, that friend can tell me, oh, there's this wonderful sentence at position 150, and you can just go there. It doesn't matter how big, small my device is, it doesn't matter what my settings are. I can jump to 150 and get there. So that's also something that reading systems have to provide. The file doesn't always give you the information to do this, so it is up to the reading system to fulfill that expectation. When reading an EPUB, people also have a lot of expectation, not just regarding navigation, progression, layout, but also adjusting how things are presented to their own taste. That's what I call visual adjustment. I'm still using the same example. This is the kind of stuff that you can do in Thorium Web, but it's pretty typical. That's the same kind of features you would find in most reading systems. So I can change the font size, I can change the font, I can change the theme, I can change spacing, I can decide on a whole lot of different things. So just to give you, for example, a user might need to bump up the font a lot and then change the font weight because it is easier for them to read. So here you have a very big font and also an adjusted font weight that makes it easier to read. Another user might read better with higher contrast colors. So that's what themes are for. It helps those users to more easily read with something that works for them. This example is a bit more subtle, but it's also a good example. So here I've doubled the line spacing, I've disabled justified text, I've disabled hyphens, and I've changed the font. So that could be, for example, something useful for a dyslexic reader. They might not need a specialized font, but the ability to tweak line spacing, disable a number of things that get in the way could be tremendously helpful. And then there's the problem child of the family when it comes to EPUB, which is um, interactivity. Um, so what can we say about interactivity? This is a very difficult one in EPUB. I'll try to illustrate why this is difficult using a pretty simple example, because people always go to crazy JavaScript, game-ish type of content. And actually, you can use something very much more basic to kind of explain why interactive is difficult. So here you have an example of a text, the same text I had before. And I've added an element that is native to HTML, which is the details element. So it's usually an element that you can tap on, and then when you type on it, it expands and show more text. So, this is like, okay, this is pretty basic. But actually, it's problematic. It's problematic because of the expectation we've talked about before. So there is an expectation that I can paginate. But if I do that, and then I have an element that adds more text, it's going to shift everything. So some of the text that was visible here on the second column is no longer visible because I've expanded the details element. The other thing that can be problematic is we've talked about progression. We said, oh, usually you can just tap or swipe. So on a good number of reading system, when I try to tap on the element I'm showing here in red, because this element is on the left of the screen, there is a pretty likely event that the reading system progression affordances will conflict with the native behavior of this HTML element. So maybe it'll go back instead of opening up the element. So yeah, it's not just an issue with JavaScript. A lot of people think it is, but it's an issue of all kind of interactions. Pagination and progression related issues. I've already mentioned them, so I mentioned that one. Conflicts on tabs, clicks, and gestures. Content shift. So here I showed a content shift that's pretty simple, but it could be worse. It could actually open up content that is wider than the width of the column. So maybe it opens something that cannot be displayed at all, or that is partially displayed. So content shift is a big problem with that when you paginate. Reading system also have concern about security and privacy. So there's this fear that if you support JavaScript, for example, it could open a lot of problems in terms of security and privacy. Um, you also have most reading systems work with web views. There are some APIs that are not available or do not work the same in web views. And then you also have dedicated reading systems that don't use a web view. They use something else. They work with XML. So in this case, you don't have JavaScript available. In practice, interactivity is very limited. It's limited because of technical limitation, but it's also limited because of expectations and limitation that comes with those expectations. So you do see some interactivity, but it's mostly limited to fixed layout, where you have less of those issues. There's not a lot of content or not a lot of reading system that can support interactivity. It is a very problematic uh, expectation to support and handle in EPUB. So now that we've covered EPUB, well, let's talk a bit about the web. Really makes the web unique, different. Well, we talked about EPUB being designed to work offline. The web is the opposite. On the web, you're always online. It is ever changing. And it's very different in nature, how you access information and how you can also expect to archive it. Um, so that's one of the downside. On the web, you can do caching, you can work partially in an offline manner, but it's not really designed to do that. You have national libraries and the Internet Archive working on archiving the web, but you're always archiving just a snapshot of the web because of its ever-changing nature. So that alone makes the web very different from EPUB. Another thing that makes it very different is the browsers are always at the forefront of adopting the new APIs. So browsers are updated at a very, very regular pace these days. So you always have the latest and greatest feature. And it's a very different pace of adopting technology when you compare it to EPUB Reader. So EPUB Reader are built on web technology, but they're not at the forefront of its adoption. Another thing that's important too, I think, is in a way the web was initially designed to do publishing, to publish information, but it's really evolving into something different. The web today in 2025 is very much a platform, and this platform is more and more designed for applications. You see that especially on desktop, where web applications have gradually replaced most of the native application we're all using. With that, you also have no real concept of publication. So the web is very much pages, resources interconnected. But there's nothing that says, oh, okay, those 20 pages, 20 resources together are a publication. Um, so all in all, I think that, while I said that for EPUB, I think the expectations shape the format a lot, and the expectation around reading system especially shape the content a lot. I think the most important part about the web is that on the web, it is mostly the content that is in charge of the experience. Unlike EPUB, where a huge part of that burden goes on a reading system. So let's kind of go through the same type of example that we use for EPUB and see what I mean by the content decides versus the expectation set the pace with EPUB. So, for example, layout. So this is a typical example of a book on the web. So the kind of content we've looked at before was also a book for EPUB. So unlike EPUB, your typical layout on the web will always be scrolled. And also a big difference is that while the layout, the presentation overall in EPUB is all about content, 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 on the web, there's not much of a difference between the content and then general navigation features provided by websites. So here I have chapter 5, but it's on Wikisource, so I also have the logo of Wikisource. I also have the ability to create an account, whatever you have. So there's no barrier between content and the rest. If you take another example that's a bit more advanced, so this is an article, just a review on a tech website. And you can see, yeah, it is mostly scrolled, but it uses various visual elements. So here it uses blocks of content, multiple columns, and they set different colors. So it's not as advanced as the type of layout that you would have, let's say, in a textbook or a magazine. But because the content is in control, um, well, it's possible to do that kind of layout. Imagine the same thing in EPUB. If I change the font color, for example, or the theme, I just go to a dark theme. Yeah, maybe the main text will be changed to white and the main background will be changed to black. But I'm not sure it'll be applied, for example, everywhere. So yeah, the kind of feature you would typically have, themes, changing font, all that stuff. If you try to apply it to slightly more complex layouts, it breaks very easily. Whereas on the web, you can just do whatever you want. And if you go even beyond that, you can have some pretty complex example. So that is a website created by Penguin, the publisher, and you can see it's using parallax. So as I scroll, some elements scroll, some of them appear, disappear. You have transition. So yeah, that is a much more complex layout, and it uses the natural way of browsing content on the web, which is just scrolling. Yeah, that type of content would be completely impossible with EPUB or PDF. Then, if we look at progression and navigation, I've already hinted a bit at that. But if I go back to Wikisource and Moby-Dick, there is no built-in way in my browser to get to chapter 4 or to get to chapter 6. There isn't even a good way to express that information. Well, technically, you could use links with rel, next, prev, but that is not really understood by browsers. What that means is that if I want to progress through the entire publication, the content needs to include that progression. So here you can see at the top, I have a link to chapter 4 and I have a link to chapter 6. If those links did not exist, I would not be able to go through the entire publication because there's no concept of publication at all on the web. That is a bit more of an advanced example. So that is an example of documentation published on the web with Gitbook. And yeah, Gitbook, it's basically they're basically designed to publish publications on the web. So it does a lot more than your average website. It allows you to have a table of content for navigation. And then if you move at the bottom of the page, it includes, links to the next and previous resource. So yeah, it facilitates the kind of experience we have with a publication, but it does so by constraining what you can do on the web. Um, and yeah, one thing that is kind of unique to the web, I've talked about what we can do with EPUB, but one thing we can do on the web and that we cannot do today with EPUB is that with every modern browser now, when it comes to navigation, I can simply select text, create a link, and send that link to a friend. So I cannot easily tell a friend, go to position 150. But what I can do on the web is I can select text, share that text, and when that person follows that link, it'll open the resource, highlight the text, and scroll all the way to the right place. If we talk about visual adjustment and the ability to customize the reading experience, expectations on the web are also extremely different from EPUB. So the one expectation that is always met on the web is you can zoom. So if I open a resource, so here I'm once again looking at Moby Dick, my browser will allow me to zoom. And by doing that, um, yeah, it's going to be kind of similar, if not the same, um, than changing font size, for example, in an EPUB. Another thing that we've started to see a lot more with browsers these days is that more and more browser include a reader mode or reading mode, or they have a variant on how to name this. And interestingly, those modes provide options for visual adjustment that are a lot more similar to what we know with EPUB. But the way it works is very different. So, reading modes, reader modes, they don't try to change the content. What they do is they extract text from the content, they create a new view where that content is added, and usually this view is displayed side by side with the original content. So you can see an example here on the very complex website I showed you before that was using a lot of scrolling, parallax, and everything. So yeah, it extracts the content, but it doesn't really keep the style. So some of the information is lost. Uh, but yeah, it is lost, but this allows me to customize. So, for example, if I have a hard time reading those colors or that font, it can be very helpful for me to do that. So, this is another example that I found. Um, it is a website that is publishing open access content, and when you read books on that website, publication on that website, yeah, they offer a number of features that kind of remind you of an EPUB reading experience. As you can see, I can change the font, the color scheme, the margins. So yeah, it's possible to do something like EPUB, but the page has to decide to do it. The content has to decide to do it. Otherwise, you're limited to Zoom or the reading mode that I've showed you. So what about interactivity on the web? I'm not going to go in details and show you everything that's possible because you can do almost everything these days on the web. Um, but as you can guess from what I've said, because the content is in control, because the browser doesn't really get in the way, interactivity is not that much of an issue on the web compared to what I showed and explained for EPUB. So just to illustrate that, here's an example. These are components meant for education. So in this case, it's a drag the words component. So you're asking students to fill in answers. And yeah, you can do that easily. So I can tap on a word on the right and drag it to the left with my fingers or with my keyboard or whatever is made available. And because the browser, is not trying to override some of those behaviors to go to the next um, resource, or to do all the kind of thing we expect an EPUB reading system to do. Well, it works. So yeah, by doing less, the browser makes it possible to do more when it comes to interactivity. The next thing kind of want to explore is, what about web publication then? What can we do with web publication? How is that different from the web or from EPUB? And in a way, you can think of web publication as a middle point between EPUB and the web. A middle point in the sense where um, we want to keep some of the good things of EPUB and some of the good things of the web. Of course, you need to do some compromise because it's not possible to do everything. By design, if you do one thing, it'll forces you to introduce limitations as well. But it's kind of a balancing act. That's what web publication is. And so it's important to point out that you can use web publication for a number of different things. Um, you can, first of all, you can just serve EPUB, audiobooks, or comics on the web with them. An EPUB, a zip, serving that on the web, yeah, it requires extra work. So you can easily turn an EPUB into a web publication, and then that'll be easier to serve in a web reader or in a general web context. So that's one of the use case, a very important one, and it has been the main use case up until now that we've seen. Another thing that's possible is you could repackage web content. So I haven't really seen that one used so much, but they are great resources on the web. Um, if I'm a teacher and I have a lot of great resources available, I could potentially repackage them and add um, a table of content or add some more content myself. So that is something we could potentially do with web application, where yeah, you could do that. Um, but another thing that's slowly becoming also used is the idea of publishing brand new publications. So I think the number one use case for web publication that are directly authored right now are for audiobooks. So we know that there are a few millions audiobooks that are distributed as publication, as web publication today. But what we're hearing now is that for education use case and also as a pivot format, a number of organizations are interested in using web publications and creating directly content as web publication. We've published, for example, um, a presentation from Hachette, so one of the largest publishers in the world, and they're exploring web publication as a pivot format. So that is a good example of what could be done beyond serving audiobooks. Um, and another example of that, uh, South Korea has published also a national standard for using web publications with comics, more specifically scroll comics. So yeah, some examples, but uh, we're going to see more and more of them moving forward. But yeah, I always go back to expectations. And I think what's one thing that's very interesting with web publications is that it is a blank page. So the web, it has existed for a long time. It's ever changing, ever evolving, but there are a lot of expectations on how things can work on the web. EPUB is not as old, but it's almost 20 years old by now, and that people have a lot of expectations. Um, Web publication, although they've existed for a number of years, they've mostly existed as a mean of serving EPUB. Um, Native web publication or web publications that are not tied to EPUB are still relatively new. So we get to decide, and I think that what shows the most potential, and that's what's really exciting about it. So I'm just going to try to summarize what that means. Um, I can't cover everything, but I'll try to give you a good idea. Um, so let's talk about setting expectation. We've talked about access. EPUB, it's all about being offline. The web, it's all about being online. You can go partially offline on the web, but it has a lot of limitation. With web publication, what we want to achieve are publication that can be completely online, that can be completely offline, and that could also offer partial downloads. If I have a huge textbook where I only need lesson one and lesson two, because that's what I'm studying this semester, I should be able to do that. I can't really do that in EPUB. I can't really do that on the web. So those are the kind of new use cases that are not covered today that we want to cover with web publications. Um, and then usually when you talk about offline, online, some of the protection aspects also come hand in hand with that. So we've already talked about it. With EPUB, you can have a DRM. You can apply a DRM, for example, for um, library use cases. So a book that expires after 21 or 28 days. We've talked about obfuscation, mostly for fonts. Um, on the web, things are kind of different. I would say protection on the web is mostly about access control. So you have credentials, you use those credentials, this sets, session, a cookie, whatever, and then you have access to the resource. That's mostly how it works. There is DRM on the web, but it's only used for video. So only a select few DRMs have access to that, and it only exists uh, because a number of large VOD organization, pushed for it um, because they needed that feature. So if we talk about progression, I've kind of covered that too. Um, EPUB, it's linear. You go from cover to cover, the start to the end. Web is content based. So on the web, progression can be all over the place. You can jump anywhere. And if the content doesn't offer it, there is no progression. So you very much need the content to provide that kind of progression. With web publication, what we're going for is something more like EPUB. So I can go through the entire publication. If there are links, I can still jump places. If there's a table of content, I can still jump to places. But yeah, we want to offer the same kind of linear progression, which feels very important for publications. When it comes to navigation, as we've illustrated, some of the most common thing we have for navigation on EPUB are table of contents, search, go to, jump to. The web, as we've said, it's all content based. So my content might offer a table of contents, or it might offer search, or it might offer tons of different things, but it'll be different from one source to another. So there's no consistency, unlike EPUB. And then there's the nifty URL fragment thing I've mentioned, the ability to select text and share it. That's great. Um, and yeah, for now, it's only on the web. So with web application, we kind of want to achieve pretty much everything. So what we want to do is have table of contents, search, uh, be able to jump to places. This one I don't think will always be available. It'll ask the content to provide some information. Um, and yeah, and also ideally when you're online, and ideally maybe offline too, the ability to select text and share it, because that's pretty great. If we continue with expectations, we've talked about layout. So in EPUB, the user decides. I want this to be paginated. I want it to be scrolled. I want it paginated with two columns. We've covered that. On the web, it's pretty much scrolled. I guess you could do something paginated, but it's very uncommon. With web publications, we're taking an approach where we're more following the web approach. So each resource is scrolled. Pagination introduces too many issues. You need to mess with CSS. You need to mess with JavaScript. There is too much of a risk that what you're doing to achieve pagination will mess things up. You could even say that continuous scrolling is equally dangerous. So I don't think that's something we'll have either, because the kind of continuous scrolling that you have in some EPUB reading system also has a pretty heavy toll on how we can display content. When it comes to visual adjustment, EPUB is super flexible. You can do pretty much whatever you want. Um, so that's very powerful and very useful for accessibility. The web, as we've seen, you can always have zoom. Most of the time, you can have a reader mode. Sometimes the reader mode has limitation and cannot access your web page. And then, of course, yeah, the content could provide more options. For web publication, we're more closely following what the web does, which means we can expect to provide a zoom feature um, anytime you need it, a reader mode that might be able to do things a little bit differently or to do a bit more that we can do on the web. And potentially we could do more. But unlike EPUB, or at least reflowable EPUB, where we take for granted that you can do everything you want with every single EPUB, with web publication, it's going to be more of an opt-in thing. So if the publications say it is fine to change things heavily, then reading systems that consume this web publication might offer a reading experience that's almost like an EPUB or closer from an EPUB. So in a way, that's going to be more on a publication by publication basis. Interactivity, EPUB, it's very limited. And frankly, I don't see a way forward for EPUB to be better at interactivity. If we keep the expectation that you can do whatever you want with the presentation, it'll always be a problem with interactivity. So that's one of the reasons, web publication follow more the web for layout and visual adjustment is because we want to make it possible to do a lot more with web publication. So the idea for web publication is to kind of behave like the web, where anything is possible potentially. There might be a bit more limitation when you go offline, but still less problematic than what we have today in EPUB. And finally, it's good to talk about the kind of platforms that can consume those different formats. For EPUB, what we see is you kind of need a specialized app or a specialized device, an e-ink reader or an e-tablet, those kind of thing. The web, you just need a browser or a web view. And you have browsers and web view in all major platforms today. For web publication, the requirement is going to be to have a web view and a modern web view. So anywhere with a modern web view should potentially work well with web publication. But that means that if you have a device that only use HTML as XML or something like this, this won't be a good fit for web publication. So the bar is a bit higher compared to EPUB in terms of which platforms should be able to support web publication. Of course, as I've said, I'm setting expectations. So nothing here is written in stone or whatever. But based on conversation, based on interactions we've had with the industry, that's currently how we think those expectations should be set. So let's maybe show you how this could potentially work. So with a web publication that's mostly textual in nature, the experience could be pretty much exactly like reading an EPUB when it comes to customizing looks and feels. But unlike an EPUB, you'll have to read that content scrolled um, and scrolled one resource at a time, not the kind of continuous scrolling you get in some EPUB readers. But then it is also possible to do something much more complex and interactive. So this is an example of a publication um, published by UNICEF, for example. And yeah, it has interactivity. As you can see, the layout is a bit more complex. So that's the kind of thing that's possible too. That is technically not a web publication, but it gives you a good idea of what it would feel to use a web publication. At the bottom, you can see it has a link to a table of contents. It has affordances, the arrows to move forward or backward in the progression. And then the main view has the full richness of the web. So it could be video, it could be whatever you want. So this is a pretty good illustration of what highly interactive content could feel like when working with web publications. And that's all actually. So I hope that this was useful. The main point of this presentation was really to convey that we always focus on technical details. We always focus on formats. We always focus on those aspects. But truth is, what we expect when reading a publication, I think, is more impactful. We've been trained to expect things one way with ebooks. We've been trained to expect things another way on the web. And web publication is a unique opportunity for us to try to figure out something else that could be a better fit than either EPUB or the web. If we're just trying to replicate EPUB or replicate the web, what's the point? So this is all about enabling user experiences for which we don't have a good option today. And there are plenty of use cases um, that are not well covered or that require you to do extra work to cover them. So expect us to talk a bit more about web application in the future. Expect us also to hopefully deliver good native support for them in the different Medium toolkits. But yeah, that's all for today. Thanks, everyone.